Hello and welcome to ATARC's webinar series. Today, topic experts will share strategies that agencies can implement to alleviate the concern of the unknown and make operations more efficient. My name is Kirsten Patton, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel. ATARC stands for the Advanced Technology Academic Research Center. ATARC is a nonprofit that facilitates collaboration between government, industry, and academia in order to enhance technology modernization initiatives. ATARC provides ongoing opportunities for cross-agency collaboration through on-site interaction, learning, and market research. I would like to welcome all of our attendees, and a special thanks to Brian Rosensteel, Simone Woodward, and the entire Ping Identity team. This afternoon, we are going to hear from our panelists, followed by a Q&A session where we will pop in a few polls and then answer your questions. Before we begin, I just want to encourage the audience to please submit those questions of your own in the Q&A section of this platform and answer the poll questions as we go throughout to ensure that you receive your CPE credit. With that, I would now like to introduce each of our panelists, if they could please come on camera. I misspoke, I'm actually going to have each of you introduce yourself. So please tell us a little bit about you and what agency you're with and what your role is over there. So let's start with Dr. Aaron Hansen, please.
Hello, everyone. Dr. Aaron Hansen here. I'm currently with OUSD R&E on the 5G initiative as a cybersecurity expert, also working with the 5G cross-functional team under Ms. Amanda Toman.
Great, thank you. Let's jump on over to Brian then.
Hey everyone, yeah. So my name is Brian Rosensteel. I'm with Ping Identity on the federal team, pretty much the acting federal CTO. And today I'm really going to be kind of also doing dual role representing ATARC because I sit on the ATARC Identity Management Working Group, and we're actually exploring today's topic in depth. So thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Let's hear from Darlene next.
Hello, good afternoon. I am Darlene Gore. I work for General Services Administration under Federal Acquisition Service. And I am the Director for Identity, Credential, and Access Management under ITC. I manage two major government-wide programs that impact ICAM, I run the U.S. Access Program, as well as the Federal Public Key Infrastructure. I have a big responsibility across government. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And then, of course, let's hear from Matthew.
I'm Matthew Wigler. I'm the Naval Sea Systems Command Chief Information Security Officer. For those who don't know, NAVC is responsible for the design, acquisition, sustainment, lifecycle support, all those things associated with all the ships and submarines in the Navy. Also responsible for all of our shipyards and all the activities that maintain the ships and submarines. We've got about an 85,000 man workforce, so I stay very busy.
Excellent. Thank you all for being here today. Darlene, I would like to start with you. If you could please kick us off with our first question. It is, what are some of the defining moments or situations that have made very clear to you the need for efficient, strong identity verification and authentication across the government? So if you could please speak to your experience there.
Oh my, I feel like I'm going to age myself, okay? So I'm gonna date myself a little bit, and I'm gonna go back into my days when I first started in ICAM, and it really started sort of like in the military. But I think one of the defining moments that I want to point out is when we first started deploying computers in the first place. Anybody could just get on the computer and the network, and we just really had no management system. But then there was a huge incident, and this is when I was in DOD, and it was an incident where there were like all the websites. This was a kiddie script that some kid had gotten all the military website, and they defaced all the website. We had no idea who was going in, coming in and out of our different websites. But this was while I was in the military. And then as we fast forward, and you see other breaches and data breaches that, a lot of people, information is important. Data is important to people. And there's a lot of fraudulent activities out there that is happening. And you really want to understand who is coming into your network environment. You want to know who that is. So identity verification and authentication became very key for making sure you manage those logical and physical access. And then in 2004, then HSPD 12 was birthed. So that was another defining moment for me when we were trying to get everyone, either you had to get the PIV cards or you all had to get a CAT card for logical access and to any type of federal systems or DoD systems. But, as we start to rely more on information systems and more computers, then to me, identity verification became very, very important. And we had to validate who we're talking to and understand who and know who's coming in and gaining access to our systems.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Darlene. And Matthew, I want to ask the same question. In your career, what have some of those defining moments or situations looked like?
Yeah, I would say I really relate well to what Darlene had stated as far as examples. There's a lot of those examples out there. I gave your team a little bit of a warning. I'm going to be a rebel on this call. Because I do think, especially as we're looking at zero trust and within DoD, we largely already have a lot of pretty good authentication in place now. And I know we're moving from authenticating at a network level to really authenticating at more of an application level, which is all good. And that's more on the enterprise side of the house. The traditional IT side of the house. One of the areas where I see a big concern is part of the rest of my portfolio, which is more on the operational technology or control system side of the house. We have a lot of networks that are real time. To make it relatable, I'll take it back to something we all interact with every day, cars.
I think we lost you. Oh, we got you back.
Oh,
sorry, go
okay. So like cars run off of a CAN bus system, for example, and there's zero authentication in those systems. A lot of our critical infrastructure in the US also is control system based. And so some of those systems, power, water, things like that, there's no authentication in them. And so that's something that I'm very concerned about. Part of the challenge is latency is a real big problem in real-time systems. And so I think we collectively as a country need to pour some resources into how can we create lighter authentication protocols that won't hinder the operation of those control systems. Because right now with no authentication in place, it's kind of like with the car. And I know some of us have seen those examples in the news, right? Where people have taken control of cars and things like that. And they're able to do it. It's the exact same example that Darlene mentioned, because there's no authentication in place. And so if you ask me what keeps me up at night as far as concerns, it's that area, it's control systems. Less so on the IT side, and don't get me wrong, I know we have a lot of experience, and even still to this day, with data theft and things like that. But in the control system arena, where life gets very real very fast, if you have a breach, that's one of my biggest concerns right now.
Thank you. And Dr. Hansen, do you have anything you'd like to add to this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the most recent things is just this whole situation we're currently in with the pandemic, and everybody's working remotely. So when we talk about zero trust and how do we authenticate the user, how do we authenticate the device, how do we authenticate with the application, I think this phishing-resistant MFA, multi-factor authentication, is right there where we need to be. There needs to be more effort or an improvement of technology to make sure that, especially now we're on our own devices. We're not on a trusted, secure government computer, inside of a boundary. So for instance, I'm on my personal MacBook right now. So how am I authenticated? With a CAC, but that's a lot more secure than a login or password, or even a one-time password, those sorts of things.
Thank you. And then Brian, typically if I end a question with someone, I'll start a question. So my next one is going to be around misconceptions related to identity and authentication in the federal government. But please, if you have anything else you'd like to add to the defining moment, you may.
Sure. I think maybe I'll go into that and then roll into the next one right for you.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, I kind of agree with everything that's being said. I totally agree on the control system side and some of those, like that absolutely scares me as well. When I look at kind of the I don't know, defining moments, if you will, of, you know, this need for strong authentication, and I want to focus specifically on some of the verbiage that you used, Kirsten, where you're talking about authentication across the federal government. And it's that across piece that I think has unfortunately time and time again had those defining moments, right? We've had, you know, tragic events where we understood the need for interoperability. Some of those events led to really the push and drive behind things like HSPD 12, understanding that, you know, we could have strong authentication, but if the only group that can authenticate it is that group that implemented it, then, you know, what good does that give us in that broader context? And, you know, that's something that's been one of the great strengths, I think, of X509 authenticators, right? So, you know, smart card authenticators like PIV, like CAC, and others, is they've got a lot of, you know, inherent interoperability in them. Now, when I think a lot about the misconceptions around identity verification, authentication in the federal government, I think we see a lot of focus just on the form factor and not a lot of focus on the understanding of what that form factor has behind it, right? So people often look at the authentication, they look at the multi-factor authenticator, but they forget about the identity vetting that has gone in behind it, right? All of those attestations of this is who this individual is and the level of trust that we can assert because they have this authenticator with various, you know, object identifiers and everything, right, to get into technical language. And that's really critical and important. I think that's one thing that a lot of people, especially in industry, you know, are still catching up on. You know, the other misconception that I'll say is, I don't know how many times in my career I've heard, you know, Pki is dead. My response to that is always, well, how does the internet run? You know, with that little lock of HTTPS. And there's always this need of classifying, you know, that some of these strong authenticators as legacy, of not working as well. And I think we've got 2 decades to show that, hey, it actually does work, but it doesn't always work in these specific situations. So we got to get better at how we approach it. So I think, to me, those are the big misconceptions. You know, yeah, there's more than just the form factor. You know, there's this entire process in how you get that authenticator in the first place. And we can't forget why we're doing that as we look to other form factors coming in play for authenticators. And then also, you know, we actually can make these work, but we have to be smarter at how we're approaching it.
Thank you, Brian. And do we have any other panelists that would like to come off mute, and I'll call on you, that would like to add any additional misconceptions that you're aware of related to this? Or maybe Brian just nailed it with his answer. That's okay too.
or just derailed it.
No,
and everyone's just
no,
like,
I have something to add on to it, and Brian really hit the spot. He really nailed it. But as in the federal space, some of the misconceptions too, I think, is so hard to implement at the application level, and you know, is it too restrictive? And for us, because we are collecting so much personal data, you know, we always have that question: what are we doing with your data? And you are so right, Brian. It takes a lot of vetting for you to get that PKI certificate, or that personal identification verification card, or, you know, that common access card in the DoD environment. There's a lot of data that you're doing, and there's a lot of vetting and identity proofing that you're doing to get to that point. And, you know, in the federal space, you know, you have to do it for your job in order for you to gain access to your logical and your physical access. But as a person, people probably think, what are they really doing with my data? So that's one misconception. So the only thing that we really are doing is vetting to make sure that you are trusted to access that information. But the biggest thing that I found, even the hardest thing I think is implementation of, PKI. That's a misconception. I would think that's my sense. Okay, Kirsten.
That was perfect. Thank you. And Matthew or Aaron, did you have anything else you'd like to add, or are you okay if we move on to the next questions? Go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, I'm okay moving on. I think again, Darlene kind of nailed some of the concerns that I would have. It really is all about implementation. I completely agreed with Brian though too, that getting it to work across agencies and across the federal sector is also going to be a big challenge. I do agree that we need to figure that out, but again, it becomes a challenge in implementation. So that's probably my biggest concerns too. It's always where the rubber hits the road, if you will, in getting it done. And we certainly have some other even like lab type systems and stuff like that that are not quite up to the current standard. So we do have some stray cats and dogs where we really do look at, okay, how are we going to implement this, and some of those challenges associated with implementation. So I agree with the rest of the panel.
Thank you, Matthew. We have a comment from Cheryl Jenkins. Hi, Cheryl. She's with our identity management working group at ATARC. She says, great spiel on misunderstandings. I'm now pushing for FPKI to move beyond end user certificates to have discussions about PKI complements blockchain and how PKI can help with device certificates in a zero trust architecture. Her question now is, what other anti-phishing MFA other than PKI and FIDO are workable solutions in industry? If one of our panelists would like to tackle that question. Great question, Cheryl.
Yeah, I'll first say I'm not aware of a phishing-resistant authenticator outside of those form factors. I'm sure there is one, but I don't know of one that also works from an enterprise standpoint. And that enterprise deployment and the vetting that goes into it, and how we can have lifecycle management, that's all really important to consider when we think of an authenticator, right? It's one of the reasons why biometrics have always been difficult. I always explain to people, right, I can revoke my fingerprints 10 times if I'm lucky, and I've maintained all 10. Other authenticators, only have 2 eyes as an example. That becomes difficult when we think about that management over time. So that eliminates a lot of the investments that we're seeing in other types of authenticators. And then I'll do a shameless plug too for the identity management working group, where we're actually looking in to take FIDO into the enterprise space, right? Because that's a credential that originally was built in the kind of commercial world around, I'll just go and I'll just purchase an authenticator or a FIDO device off the internet, and then I'm going to use that and register directly with end applications. That doesn't scale as well when I've got several thousand applications in my environment. So we're actually looking into making that authenticator more widely scalable, being able to use from lifecycle management. But outside of those 2 flavors and variants, I'm not familiar with one, but I'd love to be proven wrong, right? The more options we have on the table, the better.
And Darlene, I saw you responding earlier. Go ahead.
Oh, well, I absolutely don't know, but I've heard different things. And I was going to actually add something that I heard just recently, and one was a behavior type authentication of that, some type of AI that understands who you are, like different patterns from your habits. And I'm really putting this question out to the team, to the panel, because you guys might know more about this than I do, but I had gotten an overview that it adapts to your behavior and authenticate you based on the actions that you perform versus it being a hard token or some type of soft token. So have you all heard about that type of authentication? That's to my panel. They're all saying no.
No, so it's so we generally put that under UEBA, right? Which that's an acronym. I'm gonna get it wrong. It's like user entity behavior analytics or something. That's probably wrong, and someone's probably screaming at me on mute somewhere. But UEBA is kind of that. Hey, I'm gonna build this profile of a user, and then from that I'll have a risk score of the likelihood of who that user is based on how they're interacting with devices. I know many years ago we were kind of talking and getting excited over, hey, there's gyroscopes in a mobile device, so how I actually hold the phone and play with the phone, I can build it off of. So I know that some companies have specialized in that, but again, my concern around that is, how do I initially enroll that individual, and how do I vet that?
Exactly.
individual?
Do you build signatures?
Right. And we know that in OMB Memorandum 22.9, and I think this is important, right? Because one of the things that 22.9 mandates from an identity perspective, zero trust, is that you're going to include one device level signal, at least one, within your authentication. I think that's really important because it's saying that, look, proof of possession of private key, which is all X509 ever tells you anyway, isn't going to be enough. That in order to bring these authenticators into a zero trust landscape, we need to be looking at more than just the authenticator involved. And I think that's really important. Yeah, we need to make sure we're using phishing-resistant MFA, but we also need to make sure that during the authentication, we're being very adaptive and that we can include this broader kind of signature and analytical data inside of it. I think that's a good call out as well. And maybe that's another misconception, right? Hey, I've got this super strong authenticator. I'm good, right? Well, what does that tell us? And how much can that tell us? And what do we really need to know before we make that decision of whether or not you gain access to this resource? So no, I think that's a great point.
Matthew, were you going to
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Brian said. I'm in complete alignment with everything Brian said there. I will say to what you were asking, Darlene, we do have some experience in the Navy with some of those other forms of authentication. I will say those have largely been used in more of the shipboard environments, more out of convenience, but also added security than anything else. But to Brian's point, well, there are a lot of really interesting creative things that can be done, especially when you think about tying it to specific individuals with access. And even analytics as far as what they're doing inside of computer systems too, right? Because there is, normal behaviors and abnormal behaviors even inside of systems, which is even another thing you can monitor independent of how do they move a phone, or how do they enter keystrokes and things like that. And the more traditional biometrics. But I would say just in general that I don't think any of the methods that we have some experience with have proven out to be as reliable and as bulletproof as just our standard CAT cards and PIV and things like that. And so not that we're not continuing to kind of keep our pulse on some of those things, but I agree with Brian. I think going back to kind of where we're at is really the gold standard, if you will.
Thank you all. And then lastly, we do have another audience question. I worry about the behavioral analytics due to what happens if someone, say, sprains a wrist or something like that. So you guys are nodding your head, so I don't think we need to further elaborate on that. Does one of you want to respond?
We agree.
I'm sure there's always going to be those type of things that happen. So those, are outliers. I think it's important to determine like how frequently something like that would happen, and if so, what is the impact? Is the impact an additional layer of frustration, if you will, to take another step to validate that multi-factor authentication? And would you consider sacrificing that little bit of inconvenience for a less secure method of authentication? So we can think of voice recognition type things as well. So if you have a cold or if you're congested, sure, your voice pattern is going to sound a little bit different. What does that mean? Does it mean we don't introduce voice recognition or some other type of secure or more secure authentication on the outlier that, yeah, I may sprain a wrist, or I may have broken my wrist and now I can't hold my phone because it's in a cast? But I think heuristically then the models and the algorithms could adapt that over time, and it just may be a little bit slower or an additional step in the process of getting through that validation process or that authentication process.
Great, thank you. All right, let's pop up our first poll question here. Should be up momentarily on your screen. I use the following types of two-factor authentication when logging into my accounts, and then it lists a number of different options. So please go ahead as an audience, respond to that if you'd like to receive your CPE credit. And then next, I would like to discuss a little bit more around common challenges. So Darlene, I believe you mentioned a challenge earlier, but just what are some of the other challenges our panelists see when it comes to using the PIV, CAC cards, or other forms of factors to implement efficient, strong identity verification authentication? So if you could speak to those challenges, and then as a follow-up to that question too, how have you seen agencies overcome said challenges, if you have? So who from our panel would like to kick us off with that question? And just come off mute when you're ready to respond.
All right, so I'll go first. One of the common thread of challenge that we have is we have to remember why we have things like PIV and CAC in the first place. And one of those things is interoperability. So all multi-factor authenticators have the same challenge around interoperability. Some are really good, like X509, at being able to overcome that, right? So I've got a smart card. As long as I've got the CA trust chain and the CRL to be able to validate it, I can validate that anywhere, even if I'm in a network completely closed off and isolated from where that smart card was actually enrolled and those certificates were generated. I always like to joke about the sneaker net, and literally, we thumb drive with a pair of sneakers, if you will, to be able to transfer things like CRLs, and that works. Other authenticators, that simply isn't possible. So when we think of, and I'll pick on a non-phishing resistant authenticator like an OTP, right? So we think of like the mobile push on the phone. High usability, it's great. Users love them. It's actually too usable because they tend to click approve, even if it's not a legitimate challenge. But I have to go back to the originating system that enrolled that device. I can't have that live independent from that system and be able to authenticate it elsewhere. So I have to think through as I expand my range of authenticators that I'm using, how do I make this so that not only can I authenticate it everywhere within my organization, but across organizations as well? And that becomes even more of a challenge. Okay, I have my implementation. Now I'll pick on FIDO. I've got now my implementation of a FIDO authenticator. How do I make sure that this other department or this other agency, whom I rely upon from a sharing of data, can also validate, so that I don't have to walk around with a new authenticator per agency, per department? And we'll be honest too, we haven't even perfected that within PIV. So one of the things that concerns me, right? We've got 11 different backend issuance systems, and we wrote this up in the Identity Management Working Group as part of ATARC around some of the challenge and why some people are walking around with multiple PIV cards. So even though we've got a credential that's very interoperable, we haven't even implemented it in a way that makes full use of that interoperability. And so what concerns me is, as we look to even more alternative form factors, how much farther are we going to stray from that need that helped put the emphasis behind these authenticators in the first place?
Thank you, Brian. And Darlene, I saw your hand was up.
Well, Brian stole my answer and I want so, but he is spot on. There's a couple of things that are challenging. First of all, and I think Dr. Hansen, he hit it when he made his introduction about, you know, what was that significant event? The pandemic was a huge significant event. And the reason why I say that, because the part of identity proofing is for the federal government. I'm only speaking from a federal government card services provider of issuing cards to federal agencies. For the federal government, face-to-face identity proofing is required in order for us to issue that. The pandemic just shut that down because all of the federal agencies were shutting down. And so we were scrambling. So even though now we're updating our NIST publications and our special publications, you know, to maybe adopt more like remote identity proofing, we still haven't, you know, flushed all that out. So that's one challenge for as an issuer to our federal agencies. But in addition to that, just like Brian said, we don't have reciprocity. I'm not saying reciprocity. It's not easily transferable from one agency to another agency. It's one of these, if you get a PIV card in one agency and you are a contractor and, you know, federal contractor employee in another agency, you'll get issued another PIV card. So you could possibly be running around with 10 different PIV cards because you're working for different agencies. So one of the things that the mandate says 2209 is kind of getting to a federated approach, you know, managing the identities. And I think at one point years ago, we were trying to get to the identity broker status. I think it broke. I'm just going to say that it broke. We never got any further. And I don't want to take up any time for the other panelists, but the challenge is that we have to get to the point where, you know, it's interoperable for all the agencies and not just one. So you guys, you can shut me down because if I'm talking to
No, darling, you're perfect. Dr. Hansen, can we hear from you next on any challenges or solutions to those challenges you've been able to see?
Well, I mean, from my experience, the biggest challenges is the maintenance of that particular implementation. So I'm newly civilianized after 32 years of active duty, and it seems like my biggest challenge or frustration was somewhere along the lines of the operating system corrupting the certificate or the card, and then I've got to go back to an issuing office to get the certs reinstalled. But that's more of an implementation thing, and it's inconvenient and it's frustrating. But you know, it's one of those things that needs to be worked out because the other option is, you know, less secure. So there's always that dilemma of security versus efficiency or usability. And in this case, you know, I think, and I'm probably, you know, veering off the topic here, but we're seeing more and more that's okay and that's expected. The inconvenience of security is necessary. So I'm not sure if I answered that question right. I feel like I've run off on a tangent.
It's all about your experience. So thank you for that. And Matthew, seems you'd love to hear about your experience with that.
Yeah, I agree with all the other panelists and on all the points they made. I would like to just take a minute to talk about the inconvenience versus security that Dr. Hansen brought up, because I tend to agree as a CISO, right, that it is necessary for security purposes, but I think some of our implementations have been somewhat problematic, and I do like some of the direction coming from Zero Trust, in that maybe we shouldn't spend as much time rotating passwords and having all sorts of, you know, the crazy rules, especially when we do have strong authentication. And I know within the Navy, there's been a lot of, and I think broader DoD in general, there's been a lot of angst, especially within, you know, the broad workforce that, you know, if it takes 30 minutes to get into your computer, it's problematic. And especially if you, and it's not any one thing, it's not just the authentication, it's a whole bunch of different issues, right? And that all goes back to the implementation. But there's definitely a lot of angst, and I know some of the senior leadership looks at it and is like, well, if every single person in the workforce is losing 30 minutes every day, that adds up to a lot of money, lost time, if you will. And so I think we've got to do our best to work on the security aspects, but also balance that with, you know, we do have a mission outside of security. So, and that's probably all I'll add.
No, I think that's a great point. So I remember, you know, good couple of years ago now, and I won't name the department directly, but so I was working, you know, on-site engineering, and I used to have a tagline in my email. It was a quote that I had pulled. It was "Security is often inconvenient, too bad." And it was great, right? And it was like, yeah, so you're going to do the PKI and you're going to do the smart cards because that's what we need to do from a security perspective. And then I got asked to go down to talk with this group, and this particular group, their job was to interface with retirees. And they're like, yeah, I can't use my smart card for this because they don't have one on the other side. I can't encrypt this, even though it's very sensitive. And, you know, our policies are such that if I attempt to send this without it being encrypted, it gets blocked. But I don't have any way to do it. So I opened up my personal Gmail account and I sent it that way. And I realized, okay, we can't just take that hard line of this is security, even if it's inconvenient, tough, right? Because we have to make sure that if we make it too hard, users are just going to go around it. They're going to find clever ways. And then that completely eradicates whatever security we were trying to get in the first place. So I think it's a great point. And it's a delicate balance, right? It is hard. And that's why, you know, it's one of the things I think has been encouraging about Zero Trust is it's not just about putting in the tools, but also the development of the culture and the best practices around it. And I think we've getting finally the better emphasis and traction on that than maybe what we have sometimes in the past.
Thank you, Brian. Any other thoughts from our panelists before we move on from this question? All right. Let's pop up our second poll question then while we're here. My MFA is authenticated, and your options include directly to my applications, centrally within an SSO Federation application. It depends upon the MFA I use, or my organization does not endorse MFA. So please respond to that. And again, as a reminder to our audience, if you have any questions you'd like our panelists to cover that haven't so far, please send them in, and definitely happy to ask them. All right, so my next question, maybe we could get Dr. Hansen to start with this one. I don't think we've started a question with you yet. What are some of the benefits that agencies can expect to reap by implementing phishing-resistant MFA according to the OMB M2209? So what do you think, you know, would be a success story there, or what people could expect by this type of implementation?
Well, I would think the obvious one is less incidents. As Ryan mentioned, people won't be moving to an insecure Gmail in order to get their job done. So challenges in implementing it, yes, sure, but the things like the Colonial Pipeline, SolarWinds, any of the more recent attacks that have had, you know, devastating effects across an infrastructure will hopefully be minimized, if not eliminated, by moving towards, you know, a more secure phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication.
Great, thank you. Matthew, I'd love to hear from you next. Any additional benefits?
Yeah, well, I think Dr. Hansen kind of hit the nail on the head, because ultimately it's all about stopping the breaches and loss of data and loss of intellectual property. I would add, with the control system side too, loss of pipelines getting shut down, and chemicals in our water systems, and all of those other things, which are pretty concerning to me as well. but yeah, ultimately it's stopping people who intend to do harm to us at the end of the.
Okay, so let me ask the question a little differently then. Do you receive any pushback from your teams when trying to change this sort of culture or understanding of, why is it that we're doing what it is that we do? And do you have those conversations? And if so, how do you break it down for people who'd be in charge of that initiative?
Yeah, I think in general across the board, anytime you implement something that's perceived as making people's jobs more difficult, you get pushback. Right now within DoD, and especially with Brian's example, that's a common one that comes up, right? Contractors who have government data on their systems, and how are they protecting that data, and how can we as the government help them protect that data? I know it's kind of like, hey, hear from the government and I'm here to help. So, but it is important, right? I mean, we clearly see that the security is not where it needs to be, especially in the contractor base. And so how do we come beside the defense contractors and others, right, to help them help us, if that makes any sense? And there are some pretty creative ways out there to do that, where I think it's mutually beneficial for both parties. And so we've had some good success with some of those, but invariably, yeah, I mean, you always get pushback. So it's just, all about finding the middle ground and how you can move forward smartly in a way that makes sense for all parties.
Yeah. Okay, thank you for sharing that with us. And then Darlene or Brian, does that resonate with either of you as well?
Because I'm not on the implementation level, I don't see it. I mean, the only close thing that I could come close to is when, in my DoD days, when we were implementing the alt tokens for all the privileged users. That was different. It was so different from, they were so used to using their username and password. And yeah, there were some pushback, but I think it was just learning new processes and not, and unfamiliar with what that process is. And it was our job as the SME to help them understand the importance of securing those environments. So I think in any situation where there's a change, and I'm sure on the application level where these system administrators are thinking about what they have to do to keep that network healthy and secure, any type of change, you're gonna get some type of pushback. And then there's those people that's just used to doing the way they want to do it, and so they have created this world, they specialize in their world, and then here you come. Isn't that right, Matthew? Changing their whole world.
Yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, there is a lot of resistance to change. I will say, well, I'm encouraged, but also discouraged by the last poll question that we had put out, right? So I really wanted to see, like, everyone saying that they were using SSO. We had about 46%, I want to say, said that they were. And I think that's important, right? Because, I mean, Darlene, you talked exactly to, like, the application owners, and I think, Matthew, we're going into this as well, and we've kind of been dancing around this, of the challenge of getting people to agree to develop towards leveraging these authenticators. And that, look, and I come from a PKI background, and I love the PIV, and, if I had it my way, all of my family would be logging in with smart cards into their personal computers. They've already threatened me, don't ever do that. But the challenge has been, PK enablement. I know it's an old school term, but it's still here. Getting application owners to not just accept an X509, but actually do things like the certificate revocation, right? To be looking in at the OIDs and being able to build in authorization decisions. That's still a common challenge. And then it becomes even more difficult when you say, okay, not only do you need to accept this particular smart card, but you need to make sure that you can do all the SSPs throughout the civilian side, right, and all of the DoD CAs, and then we need to have interoperability with, you know, our community. When we start looking out to like 5i community and things like that, that's a daunting challenge to make sure that you've got all of the necessary certificate chains in the end application endpoint. And then from a management standpoint, right, I now, user leaves, things change, I need to have quick adoption of a new set of rules. That's really hard when we're doing things application by application. And that traditionally is how we've done it. But, you know, as kind of was indicated within that poll, there's a different way. And that is looking at things from a central management. And of course, 22.9, I'm a broken record on that because I you know, so encouraged by what's in that policy, talks about central identity management. But it's not just management of the backend system that issues the credential, but it's actually management of the authentication and authorization. So if we shift away, and we can still do application by application enforcement, but if we shift those rules from directly being controlled by the application to more of a central authority, right, a federation engine, an authorization kind of policy enforcement point, if we utilize those, all of a sudden, I no longer have to worry whether or not that application speaks X509 or FIDO or you know, another alternative form factor, or whether or not it can build in this policy of I'm going to check the smart card, then I'm going to check, you know, we touched on UEBA, and then, you know, maybe I'm checking with an MDM for antivirus checks, all those pieces. I don't have to worry about that. I've got a central engine that can do it. And I think that alleviates a lot of the challenges that we've seen over the last 2 decades, and I think prepares us to be able to more quickly adapt as, you know, new challenges arise in the future, as they're going to. All of a sudden, oh, wait, I no longer can trust this particular means, it needs to be deprecated. Rather than having to worry about application by application, I just do it in one place. Or I do it in a handful of places, right? Because no one system is going to rule them all just because of the diverse sets of use cases. But we can really narrow that down and be a lot more effective moving forward.
Yeah. Thank you, Brian, for sharing those insights with us. Darlene, you just came off mute. Did you have anything?
I just love the direction that Brian was going in, and it just really, I thought about, you know, a question, because I think in order to be successful, one of the things that's a challenge for us in the federal space, I think, you know, we have a tendency of living in silos within an organization. And Brian was, you know, talking about the management of the identity, but within an organization, there could be many field officers, and they're managing their identities at that field office, and there's no really central point. So I think that would be I would think would be a challenge for implementing. And I think they can get there, but it's those silos within the agencies, and everybody is managing their own identity. So to effectively implement, I think 2209, I think we would have to address that.
Thank you, Darlene. And Matthew, I saw you nodding your head too. Have you ran into instances similar to what we described?
Yeah. I think to Darlene's point, I mean, even just, you know, talking about NAVC, but NAVC is not unique at all. You know, we have all the shipyards, warfare centers, our headquarters organization, and there's a lot more than that, right? Like supervisory of shipbuilding and other organizations like that too. And I think to Darlene's point, even though all those organizations are aligned under NAVC, they each have their own offices that are responsible for implementation and things like that. And so, you know, even if I sign off on a policy to go implement, the pace at which that happens varies. And we're kind of struggling with the same thing, even just on the, you know, situational awareness of what exactly we have across the enterprise from a network perspective, from a host perspective, getting all of that centralized and monitoring it in a cohesive manner is something that I've been pushing on pretty hard, and we're actually like pretty much there. So, but that takes a lot of effort, a lot of activity, because, you know, again, as Darlene mentioned, like each one of those activities is their own entity for all intents and purposes, and is somewhat siloed. So or siloed. But so yeah, it does become a problem in kind of building that team, that consensus across all those different organizations to actually make that centralization happen is really where things get interesting, and a lot of the work and effort is really involved, if you will. So yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthew. All right, so just as a reminder, this is the last call to send in any audience questions you have, otherwise we'll run out of time. And with that, we are going to pop up our, I believe it's our third and final poll question here on our screen shortly. How frequently does your organization test the resilience of your staff against phishing? And your options include frequently, we train our employees on different phishing tactics, or occasionally we send out reminders about common tactics, or rarely we talk about it after a phishing attack succeeded, or other. So please take a moment and respond to that. And I'm curious to see what those results are, so we'll pause momentarily to put them up on the screen. Okay, it looks like for the most part, people are frequently training their employees on different phishing tactics. That's good. All right, so our last question now is around final thoughts. So anything that, hasn't been covered yet, but also out of this entire conversation, what really resonates with you that you want our audience attendees to take back to their own agency or organization and really implement, as well as just understand the importance of based off this conversation that we've had today. So just as part of like our wrap up, maybe we can start with Dr. Hansen, please.
Sure, absolutely. I would go back to the previous question, looking at some of the benefits. And one thing that popped into my mind, aside from added security, is agility. So now the workforce can be more agile. Working from home is obvious, but traveling. If you've got the computer with you, you've got your CAC, it's pretty easy for you to log in from just about anywhere. It allows you to, also, authenticate securely through an untrusted network. So yeah, there's, aside from the security, I would say agility is also another benefit that's important to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Matthew, let's hear from you next.
Yeah, I tend to go back to the control system world, just because I don't think it's getting enough attention. And I think when we look at vulnerability of our nation, I think that's still kind of an untapped area, especially when it comes to authentication. If no one in your organization is looking at that, I would highly encourage you to start, because we've really got to get our hands wrapped around that problem. And I am glad. I mean, the administration's been pushing direction and a bunch of other things, and so I have no doubt that the high level guidance is coming. But no time like the
I'll give him a minute. Oh, Matthew, we lost you for a second, but we heard what you were saying, so thank you for that. Oh, Dr. Hansen, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I can definitely chime in on that too. The other thing I think is really important with industrial control systems or operational technologies is the continuous authorization. So it's not just a matter of when a PLC comes online or when it's talking to some sort of actuator or sensor in a remote system. The addition, I mean, these are chatty systems anyway. There's a lot of communications going back and forth between the remote terminal and the controller. But to add in a little bit more and have that continuous authorization taking place, that way, if there is a suspected event or an anomaly, it could be identified rather quickly, and then hopefully that is used then to prevent some sort of cascading effect that does impact a pipeline or chemicals in water, stuff like that. So yeah, absolutely on board with everything Matthew's saying.
Great. And Matthew, I want to make sure you have an opportunity to wrap up your thought.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I lost everyone. But,
I think yeah, you were at a good place when you disconnected.
Oh, good. Yeah. So that was just it. I did hear the end of what Dr. Hansen was saying, and so yeah, I think no time like the present to really to really go and take a look at some of those systems. On the enterprise side, I think we're in a pretty good place, at least for all the areas under my AOR. There are definitely some challenges, as Darlene and Brian had mentioned. Getting it to work across agencies and things like that is still going to be a big challenge. But I think in general, the future's pretty bright, and a lot of great activities going into what I think is the right areas when it comes to authentication. So I'm overall pretty optimistic.
Good, thank you. All right, Darlene, what would you like to leave us with?
I think the core to the authentication and all of this process is really strong identity proofing processes. We really have to ensure, because there is a lot of fraud around there for fraudulent identities, people taking other people's identity. And so as we are moving forward, ensuring authentication, that identity proof, because part of this also is getting into some of those, or access into some of those public facing websites too. And I had the opportunity to sit on a panel regarding fraud identity, and it was just eye-opening. So we always have to keep our finger on the pulse when it comes to identity proofing, and ensure that we have strong processes and processes that are, that could get us to the remote where we can ensure that we vet individuals properly so that they are granted those authorizations to perform those functions. That's it.
Thank you. And Brian, we'll end with you.
Sure. First, I just want to thank the rest of my panelists for joining me. It's always an honor and privilege, and learned a lot from you all. So thanks for joining. I'll also give kind of a shameless plug, right? So from an ATARC identity management working group perspective, if some of these topics are of interest to you in your organization, we have out a white paper on kind of that multiple back-end, multiple PIV issue that Darlene was talking about earlier. And then we are, actively working on, it's not out yet. We expect to have it out within the next week or two, asking for demonstration from vendors. Hey, look, we want to be able to tie in the strong identity proofing processes and identity binding processes in order to leverage other phishing-resistant authenticators, and specifically targeting FIDO and the concept of a derived FIDO credential. So that's something that we are doing here at ATARC, and if that's of interest to you, just kind of keep an eye out for that. We're hoping to have kind of demonstrations a little bit later in the summer around it. And I think the last thing that I'll say, and this is something I'm very passionate towards, right? So the federal government gets a bad rap on a lot of things, and especially, slow and inefficient, right? The most efficient thing the government is being inefficient and all of this stuff. But one of the areas that the government does not get the credit that it deserves is around what we've built from an identity credential access management standpoint. When you look at the identity proofing processes, when you look at what we've been able to do with strong enterprise credentials, I would love to be able to have better opportunities for the government to push that back out into industry, right? I use Colonial Pipeline as an example, where it was an administrative password, no MFA at all on it, on a system that from all intents and purposes appears to have been siloed, so that there was an admin account still active even months after it was supposed to be deactivated and deprecated from use. And that caused people to have to pour gas into trash bags or whatever reason they chose to do that. But the point of that in all seriousness is, we need to get better at being able to showcase what we're doing and we were innovating in federal back into the kind of commercial industry and say, look, this is what we need to do. And I think that goes right into Matthew, what you were talking about from that critical infrastructure perspective, because that is, scary as to how far behind they are. And look, we've solved some of these challenges, especially on the enterprise. There are other systems, control systems that, we need to be focused on. We need to put these energies towards. But there's a minimum baseline that everyone should be playing at. So I think I'll get off my soapbox there. But yeah, again, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. That was a great way to wrap it up. So I want to thank our partners again at Pki Identity, our panelists, of course, for participating here, and then you all at home for joining us. So we hope that you will be at the next one. It should be up on our screen here momentarily. We can let you know what that topic is. Building for secure multi-cloud environments within state and local agencies. So you can go register for that one. It is also free up on our website under our events tab. And if you would like to receive your CPE credit for this event, please respond whether you would like us to send it to you or not. Otherwise, thanks again. I hope everyone has an amazing week, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you.